So on this episode, is that the right word? I don't know. On this video of Bible basics, I wanted to zoom in a little bit more on John and talk about his use, or the Gospel of John's use of the phrase "the Jews." Um, because frankly, it has been the Gospel of John has been used to commit atrocities and kind of pit Jews and Christians against each other, or really pit Christians against Jews, is kind of punching down, and say the Jews put Jesus right. You understand how in the hundreds and thousands of years after the Gospel of John, how this has been used against um, you know just Jewish people in general. And I'm going to make the proposition that John is not anti-Semitic. If anything, he's pro-Semitic, if that's even a word. But anyway, so I want to get into that a little bit because you're going to read that a lot when you read John, and it might kind of come off a little strange. So that phrase, "the Jews," appears often, and in the synoptics in Matthew, Mark, and Luke, it often refers to the chief priests, the Sadducees, the Pharisees. Um, the Jewish leaders, right? Whereas in John, it just says the Jews. So recall that John is the latest gospel written, 90 to 110, uh, decades after the Synoptics. Mark is around 60, Matthew and Luke 70, maybe 80. John is definitely the latest, 90 to 110. Okay. So also recall that the temple was destroyed in 70. And so that is sort of this hinge point for Jewish Christian relations. Before the year 70, many Jewish Christians, which is what they would have considered themselves as, like followers of Jesus within Judaism, they didn't think of themselves as separate. They combined worship practices with Jewish worship practices, and so they were kind of intermingling. But after the destruction, things just really changed dramatically. Um, and after that, Jewish Christians and Jews had begun to sort of part ways. Keep that in mind. So there are hints, especially in chapter 1 of John, of all these little bits of the disciples being called and recognizing that Jesus is the Messiah, the Jewish Messiah, the promised one who has come. Um, and his followers sort of affirm this as being the truth. And so right away, Jesus is pictured as not against the Jews, but as the savior of the Jews. Um, Another little episode there, Jesus clears the temple, which he does in all four gospels. That's one of the few things that Jesus does in all four. People are selling things in the temple, and Jesus doesn't like that, and he comes and he turns their tables over. In the other three gospels, in the synoptics, it's during Holy Week that Jesus does this. Whereas John, his version of the story says that he did it very early on in his ministry. He and there's some significance to that. He clears the temple early on, but doesn't destroy it. Right? He's not here to wipe out the Jews. He's not here to say Judaism has failed. We got to try something else. What he's saying very, very, very early on is that he has come because religion has become this emphasis on practices and traditions instead of devotion to God. Okay, so this is part of Jesus's whole ministry. It's not part of this sort of chapter in Holy Week. It's part of Jesus's ministry is to say that religion is good, but it must be practiced well. Devote yourself to God, not just to the traditions and practices. And so then, when he refers to the Jews, the Greek word that's translated as the Jews is Judaioi, Judaioi, um, the Jews, right? So in 422, John 4:22, it says salvation is from the Judaioi. That's Jesus says that. That's not so hard, or I should say, then it's hard to have that and say, well, we can use John to be anti-Semitic, right? No, salvation is from the Jews. Salvation is from the Judaioi. So salvation comes from the Judaioi. Now, it's important to distinguish who the Judaioi are. So we haven't quite gotten to this in the Old Testament yet, but the big story is they're about to be the Israelites are about to be taken over and deported to Babylon. They're in exile, and then eventually they're brought back, kind of in waves. And so some stayed, some went, some kind of got back, and some intermingled, and it's this whole it's kind of a mess. And we might imagine the Judaioi as the sort of reconstituting forces, the people who led the reassimilation of the Jews and they returned from Babylon. So, in other words, the temple leaders post exile. That's the Judaioi. The religious leaders post exile. Judaioi, we're not talking about, Joe Schmo and Jane Doe Jew, not just the average people. We're talking about the leaders, the people in high places in the temple. Jesus asserts, and we know this right from all four gospels, that Jesus asserts that the temple leaders have perverted the religion and led people astray. And so Jesus says it says Jesus was killed by the Judaioi, right? The Judaioi did all these things. He doesn't mean the Jews proper, the Jews as a group of people. He means the narrow sliver, the people in leadership who had gotten into cahoots with the government, the people who were in it to get rich and in it for status, the people who used religion as a way to gain power. That's very different than your average run-of-the-mill Jew. And so I'm going to propose that the Jews in John shouldn't be read anti-Semitically, but actually with the lens of a Jewish Jesus who is saving Israel through its restoration. And so, if anything, like I said, it's pro-Semitic. It's pro average run-of-the-mill Jew.